So let me start with Canada. Yes, the Canadian Prime Minister made some allegations, initially privately and then publicly. And our response to him, both in private and public, were that what he was alleging was not consistent with our policy, and that if his government had anything relevant and specific they would like us to look into, we were open to looking at it. Now, that's where that conversation is at this point of time. But to understand that conversation, you have to also appreciate that this has been an issue of great friction for many years with Canada, in fact, going back to the 1980s. Then it became dormant, but in the last few years, it has come back very much into play because of what we consider to be a very permissive Canadian attitude towards terrorists, extremists, people who openly advocate violence. And they have been given operating space in Canada because of the compulsions of Canadian politics. I don't think most Americans, for Americans, perhaps Canada looks very different, but it depends, from where the interest, where the shoe pinches. For us, it has certainly been a country where organized crime from India, mixed with trafficking in people, mixed with secessionism, violence, terrorism. It's a very toxic combination of issues and people who have found operating space there. So a lot of our tensions with Canada, which well preceded what Mr. Trudeau said, actually come out of that. And today I'm actually in a situation where my diplomats are unsafe going to the embassy or to the consulates.
In Canada?
In Canada. They are publicly intimidated. And that has actually compelled me to temporarily suspend even visa operations in Canada. So as I said, often countries look very different depending on how you see them and what your interests are. But I have this problem in Canada. And so your question, did I speak about it with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken? Yes, I did.
And?
No. Let's put it this way. They obviously shared, U.S. views and assessments on this whole situation. And I explained to them at some length, what I gave you was a summary of the concerns which I had. So I think hopefully we both came out of those meetings better informed. Look, today there are countries in different parts of the world in crises of different kinds. And we have a few proximate to us. We saw Sri Lanka, which really went through a very, very almost an economic meltdown last year, and we had to step forward because they were engaged in a negotiation with the fund, and their needs were so immediate and so serious that we actually did the largest bilateral lending that we've ever done, which was we gave them almost a package of $4 billion as a way of stabilizing their economy. The unnamed country to our west, which we are talking about, they have a much, their problems are much more long-term. They're much more deeper historically in terms of, what happens when distortions have been introduced into the natural progress of an economy. That if you have, let us say, excessive expenditure on the military, or if your borrowing has not been prudent, or if you have infrastructure which doesn't pay its way. I think there are a lot of factors there. In multiple chickens are coming home to roost at the same time. It would be a mix because, I think different people, if I don't know Cardinal Dolan, I'm a little more familiar with American politicians, including members of Congress. So I'm not, I know many of them have strong views, often electorally driven, sometimes culturally driven, all of that. So I'm a little hesitant to address specific examples. But as a broad proposition.
Yes.
Look, as a broad proposition, all I can say where India is concerned is the underlying culture of India is deeply pluralistic. In fact, I cannot think of any society in the world, and I've lived in many of them, whether I look at Europe or look at North America, and US is very pluralistic. China, I've lived in Russia. The diversity and the layers that you get in India, and you can slice it in different ways. It could be ethnicity, it could be faith, it could be language, it could be traditions. It's actually unique. It's truly, in multiple accesses, the most diverse space in the world. Now, it is something, now when you have that kind of diversity, that diversity will always have its own conversations and discussions. It will be, there will be attempts to get a certain balance right. There will be corrections, there will be recorrections. It's in the nature of diversity. The only way you won't have those dialogues is when you don't have diversity, or when you have imposed something so strong that everything is okay in that place because everybody has either been forced to agree or conditioned to agree with each other. So we actually are a much more looser society where there's almost a natural inclination to disagree, and that is our national character. Now, when you have people who have not come through that experience, who for them, are listening, it's like you're listening to the next room. You really don't know the people in the next room. You're picking snatches of conversation. And then you are making a judgment or an opinion based on that particular soundbite that you picked up. So today, since you brought up the issue of minorities in India, look, what is the test really of fair and good governance, or of the balance of a society? It would be whether in terms of the amenities, the benefits, the access, the rights, do you discriminate or not? And in every society in the world, at some point, there's been some discrimination on some basis. So if you look at India today, it's a society today where there's a tremendous change taking place because people are the biggest change happening today in India is the creation of a social welfare system in a society which has less than $3,000 per capita income. Nobody has done that in the world before. Now, when you look at the benefits of that, you look at housing, you look at health, you look at food, you look at finance, you look at access, educational access, health access. There's no, I defy you to show me discrimination. I mean, in fact, the more digital we have become, the more in a way faceless the governance has become. Actually, it's become fairer. But as I said, this is a globalized world. There will be people, you will have people gripe about it, and much of the griping is also political. Let me be very frank with you, because we've also had a culture of vote banks, and there are sections who had, in their own eyes, a certain privileged access, who today may resent the fact that they don't. It's a phenomenon with which you are not unfamiliar. I think these will be the turbulence of a democratic society. Well, let me put it to you this way, that, the world as we live it today is largely a Western construct. Now, if you looked at the world architecture, to use your words, there's been obviously enormous change in the last 80 years. If one looked at the major economies of the 1940s and 50s, they are very different from the major economies today, and nothing illustrates it more than the G20 itself. The list of the G20 will tell you is the easiest way of actually getting a sense of the changes in the world. Now, for India, when we confront a largely Western-created architecture, obviously we would like to encourage and facilitate and induce and pressurize changes which are badly needed. But it is done to add a non-Western layer and a input. So I make this very important distinction where India is concerned. India is non-Western. India is not anti-Western. So when we speak about, and I give you an example which we discussed even at the G20. It's very clear today that if we are serious about climate action, if you are looking to sustain, to ensure that sustainable development goals are well resourced, then somewhere we have to find the financial muscle for that. Now, for us too, it is the international financial institutions, the bank, the World Bank and the fund, which will be at the core of that effort. So a lot of what we are seeking to do is to improve and, I would say, refresh institutions, make them more fit for purpose. And that even applies to the United Nations. We do believe today that, a United Nations where the most populous country is not in the Security Council, when the fifth largest economy is not there, when a continent of 50 plus countries is not there, that United Nations obviously lacks credibility and to a large degree effectiveness as well. So the whole, when we approach the world, it's not with a, sort of pull down the pillars kind of approach. It is very much, what can we do to make it better, fitter, efficient, purposeful. That's the kind of mindset we bring to bear. This approach is not something new. In fact, since independence in India, this has been the basic thinking about our geopolitical predicament, which is if there are three major polities occupying the landmass, the central landmass of the world, then how do you ensure that there is a balance, and how do you ensure you are not facing an adverse balance? Now, we had a phase, I would say, late 40s, which were particularly testing for us. This was when this is still Stalin's Soviet Union at that time, I think the Indian diplomacy very sensibly set to work on the basic international relations principle of your neighbor's neighbor. So your neighbor's neighbor is intrinsically well disposed towards you. Since the 50s, actually, there's been a very, systematic mutual cultivation. Now, it's not just us thinking about Soviet Union, now Russia. It's also the Russians thinking about India with the same principle and the same logic in mind. Now, that actually is such a powerful logic, at least in our part of the world, that if you consider international relations over the last 70 years, the US-Russian relations, the China-Russia relations, the US-China relations, Europe. Pretty much every big relationship in the last 70 years has seen a great deal of volatility. You had sharp ups and downs. The India-Russia is very exceptional. It's been very steady. It may not be spectacular, so it may have stabilized at a certain level, but it has not seen that kind of ups and downs which your relations with Russia or China's relations with Russia or Europe's relationship with Russia has seen through. And that's in itself a statement. Now, if one looks at the world today, Russia today, I think as a consequence of what is going on in Ukraine, it seems to me clear, and I assume it seems to them clear, that in many ways Russia's relationship with the West has broken down. And in that case, it's logical that Russia focuses more on the Asian side of Russia, though historically Russia has always seen itself as a European power. So you are actually seeing a reinvention of Russia as a consequence of what is happening in Ukraine. And you can see much of that will naturally focus on China because that's the first and the largest country and economy that Russia encounters when it wheels around and looks at Asia. But then again, India will and has come into calculations as well. So I would predict actually a Russia which would consciously focus on the non-Western world, away from Europe, away from the United States. Look much more at Asia, look possibly at other regions as well, but Asia is economically the most active. Yep. So I guess that's what you're going to see.